So our presentation this morning is going to be, I'm sure, power-packed. This is from our colleague and former Georgetown professor here for a while that I got to know, and you have his bio here. He's also on the advisory council of the partner outreach organization of the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and is a good friend of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies as well. So this is going to really give us a power-packed view, but obviously well-constructed, as I can see, of the century of transformations. We've had some really good lectures, Professor Shahin, by
Yes.
Daniel Neep and Mustafa Aksakal and others.
Yes.
That have really put us on a different track as far as the approaches to the region. So I think we can have you go ahead. There's about 2 minutes left, but I think we can start. And welcome everybody online, welcome everybody in the room. And here we go for another learning experience.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you. And for this, of course, I should thank Susan Douglas for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be here. As Susan mentioned, I would like to build on Professor Aksakal's and Professor Neep's excellent presentations that we heard 2 days ago, and extend the lines a little bit to bring the discussion to the present. My focus will be on state and society in the Middle East, state and society on the Middle East. So I will touch on the role of course, great powers and external actors, but not as much as I would for the state itself and the society and the relation between the two. It's true that we all called the 19th century the long century, but it was also the century of Western imperialism and colonialism in the region. It was also the century of the emergence of the nation state, movements, revolts, and movements for independence and struggle, national struggle. And of course, the century for some people call it regional nationalism, Arab nationalism, secular nationalism, but of course, a movement for nationalisms in the region, and also the century of dashed, as you will see, dashed hopes and frustrations. I would like to start actually by elaborating on two ideas that were mentioned 2 days ago. One is the mosaic society, and the other one is the transitional nature of the region itself. And the reason I would like to start with this, because as Professor Neep correctly said that the mosaic society theory is a colonial theory, it still lurks around and still have a lasting impact or a profound impact on our understanding of the region, and also the interplay between the social and ethnic and sectarian composition and the future of the region in general, in light of course, of the performance of the Arab state, Middle Eastern state. Sometimes, of course, my focus will be more on the Arab state, but it extends, of course, to other states in the region, Turkey, Iran, Israel, and I will mention the example whenever it's relevant. So I would like to bring as a starter these ideas of the mosaic society and the idea of transitional society home, because actually it touched on me personally as a student of the Middle East, and as I started to examine and study the Middle East at the American University in Cairo, as a freshman, as a sophomore, as a junior, and so on. These were very kind of profound ideas that were supposed to shape our mind and our perceptions of the region. The region is a mosaic, and also it is in transition. Before I do this, let me just give you an idea about the outline very quickly. I will, as I mentioned, I will do this, and then I will go into the ideological Yes, the mosaic and transitional, I just played with some words. So I said playing with maps and peoples and the fear of disintegration. That's what it meant for us. ideological proliferation and polarization. I will show you an interesting chart that also reflects this mosaic and this kind of threat and danger. And also, I will talk about the Middle Eastern state, origins and common features, then state-society relations, and conclude with the challenges. I will leave the solutions. If you insist, I can dwell on this, but I'd rather not go into prescriptive analysis and prescriptive prescriptions for the future of the region. Usually when we're young, that's in the books or Middle Eastern books, what would they focus on? This is how Lebanon is. It is a mosaic. You can see the mosaic of religious, ethnic groups and different groups that have been for centuries cohabitating, coexisting, but at the same time, we were told that Lebanon is always under the threat of what they taught us, the vertical cleavages and horizontal cleavages that at some point led to civil war. If you look at Iraq, Iraq also is a mosaic of Kurds, Sunnis, Shias. I will move very quickly because I have so many slides and many ideas that I would like to share with you. The Shia, Arabs, Sunni Kurds, Kurds, and so on. So it is also a matrix or a mosaic of different ethnic and religious and sectarian groups. If you look at Iran, here is also the mosaic of Iran. So we were told that these were communities that, as Dr. Neeb mentioned 2 days ago, that lived in some kind of a closed environments without any interaction. For me, of course, as someone who was raised in the 60s and started to acquire political consciousness, the image was totally different. This is a region that had shared or has shared a common tradition, common history, common culture. That's what we were told. And actually the movement was toward not disintegration or possible disintegration, but the movement was toward actually Arab unity and Arab nationalism and one nation and so on. And you know all that. So as the time went by, so Iraq was often described as a state, but not a nation. Lebanon, a confessional society. Morocco, a segmented society. Iran, always, it was known as a country or a state that always needed a centralized state because it always feared disintegration and foreign invasion. That was the situation in general and the impact of these ideas. I'm not going to touch on all this because I think Dr. Aksakal and Dr. Neeb did a wonderful work and job by showing us the changing map, the changing nations, the changing peoples and the ethnic groups throughout the century, starting from 1910 all the way to 2010. What I want to focus on is a question, but this is a past. This is maybe something because these were new nations and new nation states emerging. So that's more of normal and should be expected. Europe went through the same and so on. However, here is the fear or the scare. The story doesn't end. 2006, you have here Ralph Peters publishing a vision of the Middle East, 3 years after the invasion of Iraq. How would the Middle East look like? Or actually, what he called how a better Middle East would look like. Ralph Peters is a former US Army officer, and he published his work in the Armed Forces magazine. It gained a lot of, I'm sure you are familiar with this, but you can see again something similar to Sykes-Picot. Of course, we shouldn't take that seriously, or many people say, oh, you shouldn't take that seriously. And again, the Middle Easterns are obsessed with this conspiracy theory from the West and attempts to disintegrate and divide the region and so on. But you can have an idea about what kind of design. That was also the idea of reshaping, remapping, redesigning the Middle East, reconfiguring the Middle East was also popular immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. and like other countries were starting to have some kind of a shape in Eastern Europe and so on, and go into a democratic wave. The Middle East, this is what was described for the Middle East, some kind of a reconfiguration. Okay, so let's say that this is really too much and you shouldn't take it seriously, but look at the, very quickly, I'll try to go over the kind of proposed remapping for a better Middle East. Israel should return to its pre-19, this according to Ralph Peters, 1967 borders. Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq all lose territory to create a free Kurdistan. He named it a free Kurdistan. Free Kurdistan is a new state created for the Kurds. Greater Lebanon, a reborn Phoenicia that also gains territory at the expense of Syria. Greater Jordan gains territory at Saudi expense. Sunni Iraq, one of three successor states to Iraq. This would obviously be primarily Sunni, Arab Shia state, Islamic state in Mecca. It's the Vatican, something similar to the Vatican. And then Saudi Arabia loses territory to Jordan, Arab Shia state, Yemen, and Islamic sacred state. Then Yemen gains land from Saudi Arabia. United Arab Emirates loses territory to Arab Shia state, although Dubai likely to remain an independent playground for the rich. Kuwait and Oman would retain their current borders. I'm sorry to go on and on, but it is important. Azerbaijan gains territory from Iran. Iran loses land to Kurdistan, free Baluchistan, new state for the Baluch people to be carved from Pakistan and Iran. Afghanistan loses land to Iran. Pakistan loses territory to both Baluchistan and Afghanistan. So again, something that, like the thing that comes to mind, how dare they even imagine something like this for the Middle East, and what kind for Middle Eastern state, what kind of respect, regard, some kind of, seriousness in way of dealing with the Middle Eastern state. All right, let's say that this is, like maybe exaggerated and too much. So we go to another design. I think this was 2016. By the way, Ralph Peters' article was republished, something called Brilliant Maps or something like this, in March 2023, so recently. So this is Robin Wright. Robin Wright, of course, is one of the veteran experts on the Middle East, especially on Iran, but on the Middle East. She is really a veteran on the Middle East. And she published in New York Times an article by the title of How 5 Countries Could Become 14. All right. Slowly, the map of the Middle East could be drawn, an analysis by Robert Wright. I'm not going to, again, because I have so many slides and more important things to cover. But here, for example, look at the names again. Libya, of course, will be divided into 3. Yemen will be divided into 2. Syria and Iraq will be, again, divided into whatnot. And then Saudi Arabia also will be divided into, I think, 6 or 7 provinces and so on. Now, look at the names, and as if it's coming from a movie, Walt Disney movie, where Jasmine, Jafar, and Ali Baba, and so on. So you will have Sunnistan, you will have a Shiistan, you will have Western Arabia, you will have a Wahhabistan. This is in the New York Times, all right? Now, I might sound, like rushing a little bit, but imagine a Middle Eastern young man or woman listening to this and hearing this and reading this kind of, the Western, that's how it is portrayed, the Western designs for the Middle East, all right? And by the way, the New Deal or the New Deal or the deal of the century of Mr. Trump, it's not different from these designs. And some part of it are still being implemented and enacted in the region. All right. Now, it's not only transitional maps and transitional people, but also transitional minds. This is the second idea, profound idea, that touched our minds when, and you will see it often in Middle Eastern books, this idea of that started in the early 60s by Lerner's very famous book, The Passing of Traditional Society, Modernizing the Middle East. This is a very important book. It's a formative book. It's like Huntington's book, New Order in Changing Society, or Political Order in Changing Society. Two very important books. These kind of books profess that our destiny is secularism, individualism, universalism, urbanism. It's the modernization paradigm. It's the Ataturk's model, Ataturk's paradigm that started to shape the region and so on. It's, even Huntington at some point describes or prescribes authoritarian one-party system as the solution for building a kind of a coherent society and political development and avoiding political decay in the third world. All right, back to the 19th century. Susan, could you please, 10 minutes before my time is up, you just
Yes, I will.
All right, thank you so much. Back to the long 19th century. The 19th century begins with actually a transformative moment, the French invasion of Egypt. That lasted 3 years, but its impact still exists until today. Just yesterday, I told you I'm talking from a construction site, someone coming to work, and he said, are you going to put Louis XV's living room? All right. Still, Egyptians use the French furniture, Louis XIV, Louis XV, and so on, and still teach their children French in schools. The kind of, very irrelevant, useless French in their schools, even though the American and the English is much more used and so on. But this is the impact. Missions, of course, there are some kind of structural reason, Muhammad Ali, and the need of Muhammad Ali to use French or to modernize the army using the French experts and so on. It's a big deal. However, this is how the 19th century begins, and highlights or it underscores a number of developments that still exist with us. One, the significance of the region, the strategic, geostrategic significance of the region until today. Second, the fierce rivalry between the great powers since then. Because the French and the British, now it is the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, and whatnot. It reveals the extent of the decay, ruled by infidels. For the first time, Muslim territories started to be ruled by infidels, quote unquote. That's how the Muslims viewed them. The French in Algeria, the British and the French elsewhere, as we have seen 2 days ago. And also, it also revealed this decay and the weakness, and on the other hand, the quote unquote, that's what they called it, the supremacy of the technological power and technological state of Western countries, the French and the need to, again, I'm quoting literally what was mentioned at the time, the need to reveal the secrets, quote unquote, behind Western power. What stood behind until now, what kind of, made the West more power and so on, and the need for answers in order to achieve the reawakening. Bear with me, I will share something very chaotic, and deliberately I keep it chaotic just to show you the state of Middle Eastern states and society. I hope it works. I think I should do this. Yes, and then go, yes, it will work now. This is a chart of the ideological evolution in the region since the beginning of the 20th century, before actually the 20th century. I will explain it. I can't get it right. I mean, like with graphs and so on. Yeah. The best
it only works when you're in presentation mode that the link would come up.
Okay, it's not up now.
No, unless it's on the next slide, the social system.
No, but so let me.
Yeah, go to presentation mode and then click the link and it should open.
Okay. Presentation mode, because I am now, okay. I go back, sorry about this. Presentation mode.
Yeah, right there, yep. And then if you click the link, it should open up.
There we go.
Okay, no, this is the next one.
Yeah, so go back, okay, now click the link, it should,
But he's out of
it
presentation
should come up.
again.
If
Okay.
we're, no, but now you're back in the out of presentation mode.
Okay, that's what happens when can I share it?
Yeah.
I just tried to share it. Is it up?
It's not, but if you try clicking on the screen one more time, the little presentation mode screen
Okay.
on your screen, yeah, okay. And now click on the chart. And if you click, maybe it will open.
Okay, that's what I'm trying.
Yeah, we're not seeing it yet.
Okay, I tell you what, I will stop share and then share this one. How about this? It's risky.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
We've all been there.
Okay, all right. It's a little bit risky, but maybe. Okay, it will work.
There we
Yes.
go. Oh, my gosh,
Excellent,
okay.
excellent. Okay. Now, this is very chaotic, deliberately, of course, because this is exactly the situation of the ideological proliferation that took place over 2 centuries, starting from the 19th century onward. The idea of trying to find answer to address the state of decay and decline in the region and to reveal the secrets behind Western progress and so on. So you will see this is the old order, the Islamic order, the caliphate, the consensual, belief system and things like predominantly, more or less. And then pre-modern Islamic movements, the Wahhabis, Sanusis, and so on. And then I would like you to notice something. Here, there is an external challenge. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yes.
And an internal challenge, external challenge of course, foreign threat, internal challenge of decay and need for social mobilization that's taking place. Now, there is another factor or interconnection, which is wars and how wars also lead to ideological change and evolution in the region. Since the British occupation, we mentioned the French Revolution, the French invasion, and then the British occupation of Egypt, and then 1910-12 Italian, and then the First World War, and then the collapse of the caliphate, the Arab-Israeli War, the first one, 1948, and so on. The result here is you'll have the attempts to answer from the old order, the pre-modern to Islamic modernism, and then the bifurcation that we all witnessed. I will just show you something very interesting. Islamic modernism of Afghani and Abdo. These were 2 great reformers, Muslim reformers in the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that tried to address the issue of decline and reform. And by the end of their time, their movement bifurcated into 2 main trends. One is secular and one is Islamic. Okay? From their disciples group, one group of their disciples became or took the secular path, secular nationalism, secular constitutionalism, whatever, and the other ones took Islamic reform, Islamic fundamentalism, and so on. And we kept evolving through, of course, there is no time to explain all this, but we kept evolving, they kept evolving through the years, actually through almost a century and a half, until let me take, for example, the Arab Spring. What were the main intellectual trends that appeared, like competing trends, worldviews, models of development in the Arab world and the region during the Arab Spring? The Islamic one that called for an Islamic state, Egypt, Tunisia, and so on, and the secular one that called for what would be called civic or civil state. All right, you see them here. This idea or this polarization and this kind of messy evolution of ideological proliferation in the region that took all this time. Now, okay, and the worst. Let me just then stop here and then share again the other one. I hope you are following. I didn't confuse you more. I mean, like, all right. So what I'm trying to see, this is the transformation, the transitions within these centuries. Okay. Now, from the social system or the kind of, like the old order of the Muslim society, predominantly Muslim society, I realize, of course, there were different religions, but it was a multi-ethnic, multi-diverse cultural society in general. Now, why I'm doing this, to get you to the failure of these ideologies to address the major issues that relate to the state. One is, this is what Paul Salem is in DC, I think he's one of the directors at Middle East Institute. He has a fantastic book called Bitter Legacy, easy to read, very easy, and talks about this kind of ideological proliferation, which he calls it the failure of ideology to address the issue of legitimacy, the issue of the community, identity and lack of integration, the inclusiveness and so on that we talk about now, the issue of the political process, lack of institutionalization of political roles, the issue of political development, low levels of participation and adaptability, and the issue of political thought, the ideological proliferation that we talked about. Now, we come to the Middle East with that kind of package. The new Middle East, the post-colonial, post-independence. People get angry when I say post-colonial or post-independent, but this is commonly used by others. I didn't invent it or anything. All right, now there is a huge debate about the nature of the state or the origins of the state in the Middle East. One school considered this as most of the Middle Eastern states are indigenous. Indigenous meaning old, like pre-modern. They existed before as pre-modern. And of course, the major advocate of this is Elia Hariq, the late Elia Hariq. In his excellent article, The Origins of the Middle State, I will explain what he mentions. And then the other school is that the Middle Eastern state is artificial and colonial. It's not, it did exist. Elia Hariq identifies 5 types of Middle Eastern states. 4 pre-modern, existed before colonialism. And can you see it or?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, and then because I have to move very, very fast. And then one type is colonial, but the rest, 4 types, the Imam chief, where the head of the state exercises authority, collects tax, and so on, but at the same time, he exercises religious role and temporal role. That used to be in Yemen, and now still Morocco, the commander of the faithful, Libya, Sudan, all gone except the Moroccan model, where the king is also the commander of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'minin. The second type is the chief Imam alliance system, Saudi Arabia, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab and Abdul Aziz al Saud. The third, traditional secular, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and so on. It's a tribal leader that does not completely detach from religious legitimacy. And then you have the bureaucratic military oligarchy, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia. And then he talks about the last one, which is the colonial created state, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. Okay? Now, the other school, of course, a great book by Roger Owen, of course, State Power and Politics in the Making of the Modern East. He maintains that it is the state in the Middle East is a colonial product. It is a colonial product and its bureaucratic structures. And if you look, for example, the main legacy or 2 legacies, let's say structures, that the post-colonial modern Arab or Middle Eastern state inherited from the colonial powers were the security forces apparatus and the bureaucratic apparatus. These were the 2 main, they are ready, except Algeria, of course. Then even the name reflects this kind of feeling of inferiority, because in Arabic, in English, it's not awkward. But in Arabic, when you say, for example, I don't want to mention names, but you put the name Dawlat Qatar, Dawlat Al-Kuwait, Dawlat this, so as if you are highlighting and underscoring something that you feel is missing. It's like, for example, when you say Republic, Socialist Republic country, you are describing that country. But when you describe a state as a state or try to emphasize it, this shows some kind of something is missing and you're trying to fill it. The flag, the constitution, the authority, all these are modern manifestations of a post-colonial state. Regardless of this debate, Ayyubi, this is a huge book, overstating it, but one of the best 20 books that have been written about the Middle East, overstating the Arab state, politics and society in the Middle East, Nazi Ayyubi. He compares the origins of the Western state and the Middle Eastern state or the Arab state, and he comes up with these that they are different. The Arab Middle Eastern state is totally different from the Western one. Origin, the state has emerged in its legal sense before it got social and organizational. The state predated or actually existed before as a legal entity and so on before it got social and organizational recognition. I don't know, are you following or you need me to explain? I mean, like. All right, the historical continuity also, there is crafted and imposed by colonial powers, many of them, and then economic dependence, the state depends on external forces and resources, foreign grants or rents. Now, I will skip these because this is just the explanation. Regardless, there are common features of the Middle Eastern state, and they are very interesting ones. And this you can summarize from the big debate about the nature of the origins of its autonomous from society. And that explains authoritarianism and explains, like many developments or uniqueness or exceptionalism, whatever you call it, about the Middle Eastern state is autonomous from society. In other words, I usually say it makes and breaks classes. It's not a kind of, like a product of a social formation. And that's why the decision-making is always personalized. It's not representative and it has low accountability. It's also external. And I think President Trump really highlighted this when he told him, King, pay up. Otherwise, you will not be in power for 1 week. We protect you. We are behind you and so on. So that's the externality of that state. It usually originates from a military, from a tribe, from a dynasty and so on, but it's supported by foreign and external powers. It's weak. Its capacity, extractive capacity is very weak. And however, it's fierce. It's vicious. It uses the military, security, police, repression in order to stay in power. And it's resilient, which is very kind of, paradoxically, it is resilient because of its outside support and other fragmented society, because of coercion, because of cooptation. This is what Professor Bahgat Qurani, in a very nice article in the book, The Arab State by Giacomo, called it, his chapter, weak and external, but here to stay. Weak and external, but here to stay. Okay. I touched on the reasons. Now, society. The Middle Eastern society, in order for this state, as a result of its nature, its dynamic, it's not the product of society itself or social formations, it keeps society atomized, no or weak political association or even associations in general, professional associations, syndicates, and so on. They are weak, manipulated. Classes, they have weak consciousness and dependent middle class, that therefore the chances of democracy becomes really slim. It relies on the informal structures and groups more than the formal ones. The formal ones, you see them like any modern state. Look at Saudi Arabia, look at any Gulf state, any monarchical state, and so on. Republican state, we have a parliament, we have a constitution, we have political parties, we have all this, but actually it's the informal structures that count and that can really put the strings in the state, be it the tribe, the networks, the clans, the sects, or the security apparatus. Also, it controls the NGOs to replace spontaneous social formations, which we call Mujtama al-Ahli. And then you have, in the end, weak society and fierce state. In some cases, this state is willing to go into war against its own society. And we have seen it during the Arab Spring. The statements of Gaddafi, Muammar al-Gaddafi, the statement of Bashar al-Assad and his behavior, and others, they are willing, or others, the massacres that took place in Egypt and the repression that is taking place, the state is willing to go into war against itself. Now, I will throw in a controversial idea that many analysts pointed out to this. What I did is that I just, try to substantiate, list reasons why they consider this, that there is a process we talked about, 2 days ago about the colonization and so on, foreign actors and foreign powers, but there is also a process of internal colonization that's taking place or governs or manages the relation between the state and society. And you will see the manifestation in eight features of dynamics. One is that these societies are ruled by a minority. It's either a oligarchies, military, royal family, a tribe, dynasty, but not really a power rotation and transfer, or the opportunity for people to, or for whatever, people, parties, whatever, to access power is open to everyone. It's ruled by minority, exactly like the colonization. You are ruled by a minority of foreign powers. It's superimposed structures. Usually the value system that guides the society is different from the dominant belief system of that society. And here you find this kind of rift and polarization within society itself. For example, all of a sudden they parachute on the society the 2030 visions, the SDGs visions, artificial intelligence visions, all right, that nobody shares, nobody even cares about or can describe. But you can see it in most of the Arab countries, and now they are following the 2030 vision or 2050 vision or whatever vision. And the models, the strategies for development. If you look at the 30s, for example, the strategies are Stalinists for development, Stalinist development strategies that are kind of superimposed. The westernization, the secularization, and all of these elements. That results also in alienation from the rest of the population. They are more, as someone, like the Davos, when Davos was very kind of, popular, they tell you the Davos culture, that these kind of third world elites, when they go to Davos and so on, they start discussing with the first world elites, how to buy apartments and the prices of apartments in Geneva and so on. This is part of the International Association of Elites from the third world as well as from the first world. So there is an alienation from the population themselves. I can give like separate lectures on these issues, but we have really to move quickly. I still have 2 slides, I guess. Then you have the middle strata. Usually they rule by a middle strata, like exactly the British and the French. There is some kind of a different type of intellectuals, intelligentsia in between the state and society that facilitate the relationship. All right, this is the kind of, a middle strata. It could be false intellectuals, civil servants, or what we can call awlad ad-dawla, the children of the state, the children of the state. This is a very important phenomenon, but maybe we discuss it somewhere else. They rule by coercion and repression, exactly like the colonial powers. They extract resources. If you look at, for example, all of them, they talk about sovereign funds, their money in Swiss banks, in American banks. They always extract the resources of the country and deposit them outside, exactly like the colonial power. And then there is always external affiliation. There is this kind of link, act as a satellites. And of course, health, education, industry lag behind under the rule. All right, now 2 slides, and then I will conclude. Okay, what's the kind of way forward? What kind of challenges is the state going to face? At the level of the political system itself, there are 4 main challenges that need to be resolved. And I'm claiming that all, especially Arab state and maybe Iran and maybe Turkey, maybe still Israel, of course, there are issues. The first challenge is the challenge of identity, the identity of the political system itself, of the state itself. They are modern, but they are tribal at the same time. They are sectarian at the same time. They are regional at the same time. They are provincial at the same time. I think, it's obvious, this idea of, sectarianism that's cutting across and so on. So this kind of, like a common inclusive identity still has not been developed. It doesn't mean, by the way, I don't want to portray it as totally negative and so on. They're surviving, but surviving by other means, either by cooptation, by patronism, by coercion, not by the natural commitment to a shared identity. Development and economic growth. This is the second big challenge. Democracy and liberties and external environment, how to deal with the regional, and this is what every political system in the region needs to resolve, and it hasn't resolved. Now, when it comes to the regimes, the incumbent elites themselves, also 4 challenges. Managing the state itself, understanding how it operates and how they steer it, tame it. Look at what happened to the Muslim Brotherhood. Look what happened to the Tunisian case. everybody was elated by how Tunisian, like the Nahda party was, compromising, trying, to build a troika and so on. Nobody understood actually the levers of the state, the dynamics of the state, how the deep state and how it functions and so on. And I think if you look at Tunisia, it's the deep state that made this kind of counter coup, not a university professor. The second one is authority and power, the legitimacy issue, the rule of law, order and acceptance. Again, not resolved. It's by traditional legitimacy or by coercion, not by the democratic legitimacy. State-society relationship, the issue of governance, meeting needs and expectations of society. Why the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt won the elections by over 50%, and in 1 year, their popularity dropped to maybe God knows. I mean, there was a kind of a revolt against it in 1 year. Here is the answer. The need to understand the needs, social and economic needs and expectation of the people themselves. And then finally, relations with the outside. You need to be predictable, acceptance, support, and cooperation from the outside, how to deal with the outside at the regional and international level. I will stop here because I think, I took like 35 minutes. And if you have any kind of questions, I'm happy, of course, to address them. And I hope, it was not, I know it's a little bit incoherent, but I think it gives some kind of, points for discussions that can be useful.
So we can take questions both online and in the room. Thank you very much for that so far. My first question is there any hope?
Yes. Excellent question. Excellent question.
He has ideas.
Yes, excellent question. Do you want to respond now or take more questions?
Let's see if there are any questions online. Please use the raise hand function. In the meantime, Jennifer.
Oh, I just had from a comment from that beginning map. I thought it was very interesting that a country that I don't know, are they willing to accept a Middle Eastern map like of the United States redrawn to give all the indigenous nations sovereignty? It's just, that was very interesting.
Yes, I agree.
Well, our
Just
very
from the
own
United States. I'm sorry.
no.
Just from like a United States perspective, because the United States is such a
Yes.
the way that it's been built is yeah.
Well, I was just going to say Marjorie Taylor Greene has some of her own ideas about how.
Let's not start with her.
Sorry, I took some notes.
Okay, Maral, and I'm waiting for some hands to raise online.
There you go.
Can you explain a little bit more on the controlled NGO, which you referred to it as the Mujamma al-Ahli? I didn't
Yes.
understand what that meant.
Of course, sure. Okay. Anytime you want me to start answering, let me know.
Oh, yeah, I mean, no,
Yes,
go
yes,
ahead.
sure.
Yes, go ahead,
That's
please.
just like, I didn't
Okay.
understand what it's all about.
Yes, yes.
Control.
All right. Now, with the first comment about hope, I'm sorry if I give some kind of, like a kind of pessimistic vision about the Middle East, but I think anyone who observes what's going on in the Middle East, in Tunisia, that 2011 was a great moment of hope for all of us, for change, for a better environment. And it was supposed to be really a profound moment of transformation of the region itself, from a region that's viewed as radicals versus moderates into free democratic country versus authoritarian countries and authoritarian regimes. And the democratic countries and regimes and the free states, Arab states and Middle Eastern states deserved support and encouragement, which did not happen at all. On the contrary, I mean, the whole process was stalled. Now, is there hope? Yes, because we have seen there is, if you look at change is a process. What happened in 2011 also is a process. And we have two approaches that we can follow. Either the gradualist reformist one, that we keep on that process, relying on the development of, or the increase in political awareness, political consciousness, changes in demographic structures, the youth bulge and so on, and the needs of these youth, and eventually things will start improving and reforming and so on. And the other approach is that relates to the nature of my lecture. I'm not, advocating anything, but because it will be ideological, and this is not the point for it or the place for it. That relates to my nature. The post-colonial state needs to be dismantled completely. It has failed to address and has been a subject of still foreign intervention. And the regimes that are in place are playing this game with the great powers still in the same manner that they used to play it, to the extent that, like the lady that mentioned, for example, can you imagine this happening to the United States or to Russia or to any other countries, that foreign powers redrawing the map or deciding the fate of nations and people and playing with the so this colonial state has run its course and needs, and that's a radical, of course, approach. So which is not possible or plausible for the time being, because the regional powers and the international powers will never let this region to get out of control. Let me just share with you something, I hope it's here. That, like maybe explain what I mean by this. Oh, I think all right. I'm sorry about this. I don't know what happened. The screen has stopped.
It somehow got unshared.
Yes. All right. There are. What I wanted to say is that there are some recurring. Yes, here it is. The recurring pattern. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we talked about the 19th century, 20th century, 21st century. There are recurring patterns. There are transformations and also recurring. One rules, if you wish, no regional power to emerge. No unity. This region should not be ever united. 3, this region should always be drawn into protracted internal conflicts, wars, which I called, and I will show you, lost decades. I will come back to this lost decades issue. 4th, you need to separate the region from its natural security belt. There is the Arab heartland, and there is Iran, there is Turkey. These are our security belt of the region. And then 5, the region has to be integrated into the world economy in order to ensure total hegemony over its resources. Okay. All right, now, what are the lost decades? Where everyone, okay, let me just do this. Where every region was benefiting from the changes, the global changes that were taking place, you will see that the Middle East were always drawn into at the eve of every decade into a major crisis. That either by its own making, I'm not trying to just to be xenophobic here, either by its own making or induced by foreign powers. So the last decades, 1980, the Iranian Revolution, we're talking about 1980s, all right? The Iranian Revolution, that was a moment of change, of course, a revolution. We all teach it, that it gave a blow to the modernization theory and the relevance of religion, and again, the belief system in the region. And then you have a whole decade of war, Iraq-Iran war, that depleted the resources of the region. Then you have collapse of the Berlin Wall and the democratization everywhere. And then all of a sudden you have Iraq invades Kuwait, Gulf War, and then the region goes into a period of crises, a decade of crises, the Iran-Iraq war and its manifestation. Then the 2000s, globalization, liberalization with all the opportunities that can offer, all right? Then you have the end 2001, the 9/11 and the global war in terrorism. And you know what happened to the region, of course. 2011, 10 years later, you have the Arab Spring, then you have a counter-revolution and the collapse of the nation-state order. Then 2021, the deal of the century and redrawing the region. That's the, of course, this needs a lot of, like verification and validation and so on, but on the surface, it has some kind of maybe validity to it. Now, come to the NGOs and Mujtama al-Ahli. All right. As you know, the Middle East is old in its structures, old in its history, old in its practices and way of life. There are spontaneous, natural associations in the Middle East that kind of survive. The Middle Eastern state in general, like the Islamic state, is a non-intrusive state, the Islamic state, not the Middle Eastern. The Islamic state historically is a non-intrusive state. The initiative, usually social, economic, and so on, usually comes from society and how it organizes itself. The concept of al-Ummah, in its inclusive sense, the concept of al-Ummah. The word state was never mentioned in the Quran except once in a totally different context. But what's always mentioned is the Ummah. So the expression Islam is religion and state is a new one. Actually, it's a religion and Ummah. So that's the Mujtama al-Ahli, the spontaneous al-Awqaf, the mosque system, the churches, the schools, the spontaneous socio-economic formation of society that relies on its own initiative and resources in order to sustain and live and survive. Now, the NGOs are totally different thing. They are different from al-Mujtama al-Ahli. The NGOs are a modern associations that are being regulated by the post-colonial state, like everywhere, by laws. They are not spontaneous, by laws, by ministries, and so on, that regulate, for example, their donations, their activities, and can muffle and actually stifle them. That's exactly what's happening in so many authoritarian Middle Eastern states with regards to the NGOs. NGOs are good, are very good, but they are different from the civil society. They are different from the Mujtama al-Ahli. I give you an example. After Mubarak's onslaught, that was mid-90s, on the and his, he developed a new association law and so on. I was a professor at the American University then in Cairo. All of a sudden, after he cracked down on the NGOs, I get, like really kind of a wave of scholars, American and so on, Europeans, that are starting to ask me about something, NGOs, but that are part of this spontaneous society, that represent the guts of the Egyptian society, al-Mujtama al-Ahli, this civil society. They were asking about, for example, Jam'iyya al-Shar'iyya, Ansar al-Sunnah, and so on, very old, 100, 200 years, the faith-based NGOs, if you wish, like the Coptic Church and its affiliates and Sunni and religious associations and so on. Of course, I personally refused to participate in this nonsense because I told them this is the guts of society. If you draw attention to them, then society is finished. You're not doing service. This is not scholarship. Why? One association, Jam'iyya al-Shar'iyya, was in charge of 470,000 orphans in Egypt. 500,000 orphans in Egypt.
This is one NGO, you said, is in charge
yes,
of all that?
one, Jam'iyya al-Shar'iyya, only one, 500,000, something that the state cannot even provide. The Egyptian state, not even NGOs, the Egyptian state cannot even provide for 500 million orphans. I'm sorry, 500,000. I'm sorry, 500,000.
Now, we have a question from Edward Mahoney
Yes,
online.
of course.
Actually, I think you've actually answered part of it already, talking about like the colonial nature or the impact of colonization. I was wondering about earlier forms of government, specifically the Ottomans, and how that would have been different from what you're seeing today.
Excellent. This is an excellent question, and I believe, of course, like Dr. Aksakal and Dr. Neep, because they touched on this but I think from more of a political, that it was not a uniform. It was not a uniform, even though there was, the Ottomans seemed to be, a centralized authority that Muslims, like paid tribute to the Caliph or the Sultan and so on. However, it was not a uniform style of authority. Like, for example, there was some kind of a physical presence, as they explained, in the Hijaz and maybe in Sham and Iraq and so on. But you will find that some of the provinces actually enjoyed some kind of autonomy. Like Morocco, for example, enjoyed a special status. It was never under Ottoman rule. But there was some kind of an implicit, not allegiance, but recognition of the Ottomans, but not in terms of authority. Yemen had a special status. Even Kuwait had a special status when it comes to rule and some Gulf countries, states at that, or provinces at that time. So this is one point with regard to. The second point is many of the Ottoman vice-regents that they were sent to rule, for example, in Algeria, in Tunisia and in Libya and so on, they started to gain some kind of autonomy and become localized, like the Hafs, for example, in Tunisia, or the Karmalis in Libya and the Husseinis in Algeria and so on. So they became localized dynasties ruling again nominally on behalf of the Ottoman rule. The other thing, of course, was at the local level. The Qa'im Maqamiyat, for example, that was in terms of how to resolve this kind of, the mosaic, the ethnic mosaic and sectarian mosaic, and this kind of communal recognition under millet system, which was very important in kind of, maintaining some kind of harmony and coexistence between these. So there was a flexibility. Bernard Lewis, for example, in Multiple Identities in the Middle East, he referred to this. And he referred to the negative impact of the nation state on communities in the region, and how under Ottoman and how under Islamic rule, many of these communities lived better, and they were better off than, for example, under the nation state. So there was flexibility.
We have a question here.
Yes.
Yes, I'm wondering, in all these sort of plans or ways of analysis of what could be, what was, where does economy, thinking about the economy, fit in? I mean, apart from just the divisions or map makings, or where's the thinking about the economies of this?
Excellent. As I mentioned, very good question, as I mentioned, but I expected this, of course. As I mentioned, I focused on the state and society. The economy, of course, it's a mixed package. In order to be, balanced as much as I can, because I teach a whole course on the political economy of the Middle East. There are areas where we can see improvements. And as, for example, Henry and Springborg, in their book, Globalization and Development in the Middle East, they say, compared to 50 years ago, the Middle East is better off in terms of infant mortality, in terms of literacy, in terms of schooling, in terms of numbers. In terms of numbers, the Middle East is better off. However, if you compare the region, which is a middle income region, to other regions, we are above Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. The region is above sub-Saharan Africa. Given the fact, so compared to other regions, it didn't fare as well as when you compare it to its status 50 years ago. It's a middle income region. If you, for example, let me just, give you some kind of, figures. When we say it's a middle income region, so it's, here we're talking about a per capita income of $5,500 or more per capita. However, there is a huge disparity between incomes in the region. For example, Somalia, we said it's 5,000 per capita average. Somalia, per capita income is 300 annually. Yemen, 800. Qatar, 68,793. So it's one of the unequal regions in the world.
We had, I'm sorry, we had a question here.
Yeah, hi, thank you for this excellent
A little
presentation.
bit louder, please.
Louder?
A little bit louder.
Yeah, louder. I have a question about terminology used in today's time versus what was used in the past in the Arab world. Through the entire lecture, you mentioned states from North African region, Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, and you mentioned other states in the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. I'm confused when I'm teaching my students, at which point of history did we lose the terminology Arab nation? And why this terminology is replaced everywhere in the books, in the records, in the media, with a much narrowed terminology, the Middle East. Like, why a whole nation that 90% of its population shares religion and language is narrowed to a terminology that is called the Middle East? Thank you.
Excellent question and a very big controversial question. I will try to be very brief. We know that the Middle East is a geographic term and not reflecting actually the true nature of the population of the region who share common language, predominantly common language, common history, common traditions, and they used to tell us common aspirations at the same time. Here we're talking about the Arab region, but the Arab region not from a racist point of view, from a multi-ethnic, multicultural, diverse point of view. Now, if you want, this is very ideological, of course, and it will never be resolved. You know, Arab nationalism versus regional, whatever nationalism or territorial nationalism, whatever they call it. Now, 2 points, just maybe interesting points about the region and where we lose it and so on. One is, surprisingly, the importance of urbanism in this region or urban centers in this region. Over 50% of the population of this region live in urban areas, and particularly in capitals. The capitals are extremely important to the extent that, for example, when you talk about someone in Egypt, in Upper Egypt, and he's going to the north, what does he say? Or what does she say? Ana nazil Masr. Ana nazil Masr. I'm going to Egypt, Masr. So the Cairo is Masr. Algiers, Aljazair is Algeria. Yeah. It's the capital and the country itself. Can you see the kind of, you know, how the capital is conflated with the name of the country? Sham, Damascus, Kuwait, the capital is Kuwait, and so on. So this is one. When did we lose it? Recently. I will give you an example. I asked my grandmother, not my great-grandmother, my grandmother, where are you from? She said, I don't know, we are from Sur. I was like 14 or 13. I said, where is Sur? She said, I don't know. We called it Blad al-Sham. She didn't know where she was coming from. She knew the city she was coming from and the province. So I said, did you have a passport? She said, yes, it was an Ottoman subject. So when did we lose it? Recently. After 1914, 1921, as these countries, emerging nation states started to materialize. And as Roger Owen, they started to invent a national anthem. They started to invent a flag. Look at the flags, funny flags. Lion, red, white, blue, black, white. Can you distinguish between the Kuwaiti flag and the Palestinian flag? Or the Qatari or the Bahraini? So they invent most of these kind of, you know, like nation states concepts in order to give them some kind of
We have an excellent question from online to close with.
Yes, sure.
Suad Maleh online says, as we talk about hope, do you think that the change that started in the Middle East in 2011 is the start of liberation from European colonialism, or is it a start of another division within the states themselves, whether socially or politically?
Both.
Excellent questions and excellent questions. It's one phase in a process. Unfortunately, like we say, it took a country like England or America 300 years, 500, 600 years to become democratic. Unfortunately, we have to go through the process. As I mentioned before, there are two approaches. One is this one, wait, and we keep, trying until, because look, we're much better. 2011 were much better than, for example, 1919 or 1920 in Syria or whatever. Our demands are different and our aspirations are different. And the other process is, as I mentioned, that this state, post-colonial state, has to go. I stopped.
Okay. We have come to the end of our time. I would really like to request that you send me this PowerPoint. Do we
Yes,
have
sure.
your permission? Because it's full of some really rich data. I say it's full of really rich data and that our teachers can use in the classroom.
Of course, of course. You have it already in your inbox.
Okay,
I sent
thank
it like
you.
2 hours ago.
All right, thank you so much. We really
Thank you.
appreciate your
It
scholarship.
was a pleasure. It was a pleasure being here.
I do want to mention a couple of resources that I'm going to put up into them. One of them is especially relevant to this presentation, is a little PowerPoint. I will say a little PowerPoint I made at the challenge of the head of Fairfax County Social Studies, which is an interpretation, almost like an infographic. It's a PowerPoint, but it's an infographic laying out the outlines of the nation state according to Benedict Anderson. It's kind of fun, but it makes that whole amazing book of Benedict Anderson, it's called Imagine Communities. It makes it legible to students. So we don't just take this foolish concept of nationalism for granted. How was it constructed? And some wonderful ironies. The most important irony, I think, that I recall from the book is a section where he talks about the strife that went into building nations. And he has a chapter called Remembering to Forget, which is very relevant to our situation of teaching about, for example, our past. So you would say, remembering to forget what happened with Native Americans, remembering to forget what happened with slavery, because now we're supposed to all unify and become, this harmonious nation. So it goes into flags and museums and even currency and all kinds of kind of amazing things about modernization. So I'm going to put that up. It's again one of those resources you should be able to use, pretty briefly in the classroom to lay out a discussion, and then ask students, well, show us examples of these things that he points out. And of course, Benedict Anderson's book was all about why do we live in nation states? What is that? What's going on with that, right? And I think that's a nice undercurrent from what we've been talking about here. And I was dying to ask him one more question, which was, of all these abstract structures we've been hearing about and analyses of the abstract structures, I really wanted to ask him, maybe I will by email. We always hear about the culture of the family in this region, and others, of course, with its human structure, but it's almost like the strength of the family, which is battered from every side, people having to emigrate to work and going to the city versus where they work kind of cohesively in villages and stuff like that. So the extended family is certainly under pressure, but it almost seems like in these very distorted states that the family somehow is trying to hang on economically, is trying to hang on culturally, is trying to hang on religiously, and is certainly, providing backstop for it. I mean, my husband is from Egypt, and there's a big extended family there too, but it's almost like people just trying to survive, in some way in the midst of all this. what the state is doing. And of course, all of what he was echoing is brought out in really good but complex analysis in Wael Halak's book, The Impossible State. So I wonder if we ought to, as a strategy, start really thinking about you know, getting away from the sort of history of regimes, the view from the center, as they call it, and start looking at some of these issues that get to the people, as William called it, the view from the edge.
Yeah.
And social history.